Welcome to the deep dive. This is where we take sources you send us, unpack them, and, well, pull out the key insights you need nice and quick.
Yeah, think of it as getting the core knowledge without getting bogged down.
Exactly. And today we're jumping into some really fascinating early psychology research.
We are. The source today is called A Study of Mental Statistics. It's by Joseph Jastrow, and it was published, get this, way back in 1891.
1891. Wow. So a really early attempt to, quantify the mind?
Pretty much. One of the very first tries to use numbers, statistics, to understand how we think. Imagine trying that back then.
Right. So our mission here is to figure out what this old study can tell us. Things about maybe our shared thought patterns, how our minds naturally link ideas.
And also some interesting potential differences Jastrow noted between the men and women in his study. It's quite something.
Okay, let's get into it. Jastrow's main goal was to study those mental processes that happen automatically, right? The unconscious stuff.
Exactly, the stuff we don't consciously direct. And his method was, well, pretty clever for its time. Simple, but clever.
How to do it?
He got 50 of his psychology students. It was the first 25 women and 25 men who submitted, and asked them to just quickly write down 100 words. Any words?
Just words, not sentences.
Nope, that was key. He specifically warned them not to write sentences. He wanted, raw associations, unfiltered thoughts.
Yeah.
And they had to note the time it took.
Okay, so 50 students, 100 words each, that's 5,000 words total. What did he find?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting. Out of those 5,000 words, only 2,024 were actually different, unique words.
Wait, less than half?
Yeah, a huge amount of overlap. It strongly suggested that even when we're trying to be random or, free associate, our minds tend to dip into this surprisingly limited shared vocabulary.
Huh. Like a common mental toolkit or something?
Sort of, yeah. And it gets even more focused. He found that a core group of just 758 words were repeated so often they made up almost 3,000 of the total words.
Wow. So a small fraction of words did most of the heavy lifting.
Exactly. And the top 100 most frequent words. They accounted for about 30% of all the words written.
Okay, that really drives home his idea of a mental community, doesn't it? This shared foundation for how we think, or at least what words pop up first.
Precisely. And he also noticed where these common words appeared. They tended to show up right at the beginning of the lists people wrote.
Ah, so the most common words are also the most accessible. The quickest to mind.
Seems like it. The less common, maybe more unique words tended to come later in the lists. It suggests the easiest thoughts are often the most shared ones.
Interesting. Did he categorize these words?
He did. He created this table of frequency and grouped all 5,000 words into 25 categories based on how often they appeared. Things like animal kingdom, wearing apparel, proper names, verbs, implements, and utensils.
The basics of everyday life back then, I guess?
Pretty much. Interior furnishings, adjectives, foods were also big ones. Gives you a snapshot of common mental furniture, you could say.
And he found differences in repetition within those categories.
Yeah, an interesting point. Repetition was actually highest in the smaller categories. His example was stationery, not a huge category, but words like pen, paper, ink got repeated a lot within it.
Okay. Now, you mentioned gender differences earlier. What did Jastrow find there?
Right. This was a pretty clear finding in his data. The women in the study repeated each other's words much more often than the men did.
Really? How much more?
Well, the stats showed women used fewer different words overall, about 1,123 compared to 2,375 for the men.
Okay.
And women had fewer unique words, too. Words only used once, 520 for women versus 746 for men.
So statistically, the women's lists were more similar to each other.
Yes, that's what the numbers suggested. And looking at those categories we mentioned,
Yeah.
women showed more repetition specifically in things like apparel and interior furnishings. They also just used more words from those categories overall.
Okay. And the men?
Men showed more repetition in animals and listed more types of animals. They also dominated categories like implements and utensils, professions, and, interestingly, abstract terms.
And women were more represented in?
Things like foods, amusements, arts, and educational matters. Jastrow sort of interpreted this pattern, suggesting women focus more on the immediate, decorative, and personal, while men lean towards the remote, useful, general, and abstract.
We have to remember this is like 1891 context, of course.
Absolutely. It's an observation from that specific group in time. Very important to keep in mind.
Okay, so beyond just the words themselves, what about how they were connected? The associations?
That was trickier to analyze, he admitted. But he found clear patterns. One was association by natural kinds.
Meaning?
Like someone lists dog, then cat, then horse, grouping similar things together, animals, furniture, whatever.
Makes sense. What else?
Another one he found really striking was association by sound, rhyme or alliteration.
Oh, interesting. Like cat, hat, mat.
Sort of, yeah. Or he gave examples like nail leading to knife, maybe because of the sound or just the sound pattern. He said this was more common among the men in his group.
He called them ear-minded, right?
He did. Yeah, suggesting some people associate more based on how words sound.
What other kinds of links did he see?
All sorts. Piano suggesting player, so object and user. General to specific, like animal, then horse. Hold apart, like boat, then oar. Synonyms hit strike. Things that go together, like bread and butter. Even contrasts or opposites.
So our minds jump around in lots of different ways.
Definitely. He also talked about a central idea, maybe, with associations radiating outwards from it, like spokes on a wheel.
That's a cool image. What about repeating the same word? Did people do that? And if so, what came next?
Good question. He looked at the 20 most frequent words and analyzed what words came immediately before and after them. He found a really strong community of association, meaning if someone wrote down, say, house, there was a high chance the word before or after it would be one of the small set of commonly associated words.
Predictable neighbors, in a way.
Yeah. And interestingly, a word was slightly more likely to suggest the same following word again than it was to be suggested by the same preceding word. A subtle difference in forward versus backward association strength.
And the gender pattern again?
It showed up here too. The women's neighboring word associations were even more similar to each other than the men's were. Greater community of association among the women.
Fascinating. Okay, one last bit, the time it took. Did that reveal anything?
Well, the average time to write the 100 words was just over 5 minutes, about 3 seconds per word.
And was there a difference between men and women there?
No. No significant difference in the overall time taken.
Did he try to figure out how much of that time was thinking versus writing?
He did. He estimated the physical writing time and subtracted it out, trying to isolate the thinking or association time. He came up with estimates suggesting the average association time was just over a second per word, like 1.17 seconds.
Wow, that fast. Just bang, 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 the next word comes.
Pretty much. A little window into the speed of those automatic mental links.
So wrapping this up, this Jastrow study from 1891, this deep dive into mental statistics, it really shows, quite surprisingly, how much common ground there is in our vocabulary and maybe our thought pathways.
Yeah, that limited number of unique words, the common association types, it points to a shared mental landscape, at least for that group. And then you have those observed gender differences in word preferences and how strong the association seemed, again, for that time and place.
Which brings us to you, the listener. As you hear this, does any of it ring true? Thinking about your own word choices, how ideas connect for you, do you see echoes of this mental community or these association types?
Maybe those historical observations about gender differences spark some thoughts, too, about how things might be similar or different now.
And yeah, that leads to the final thought. This study is ancient, relatively speaking, over 130 years old. How do you think things have changed?
Right, with everything, culture, the internet, education, technology. How might our mental statistics look today if we reran Jastrow's experiment now?
What would we find? Would there be more diversity in words, different associations, or maybe surprising similarities still?
Something to definitely ponder. A lot could have shifted in how our minds connect the dots.